things like rope experts in as collaborators who pose as experts to sort of recertify the authenticity of the work, or they pose as a curator who's giving lectures about it as if they're not the maker. Like, have you done any of that particular kind of sort of public posing to re-authenticate the work?
We haven't. I'd say maybe that our work kind of exists in a more kind of absurdist kind of space. So I could imagine doing that if it got so over the top that it was kind of completely ridiculous. But, oftentimes we have to be careful as well, because there's a whole kind of, I'd call it the Monty Python pitfall of, if you get spurious kind of like people to authenticate what you're doing, which in our case, because it's already so absurd, I kind of think that, that would be something we'd have to be cautious with.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think about how your work with photography does mean that the work in a certain sense has to fall post the invention of photography. But that leads me to wonder two things. One, if there's something special about the early 20th century that appeals to both of you, and maybe it's connected to Nicholas's family history, I don't know. But then I noticed the rise of drawing as an element, non-photographic media in the work. I'm wondering if that opens the possibility of setting projects further back in history before photography, or again, that's not on the table.
I think you bring up an interesting point. It's certainly something we discuss, is that if we want to have that moment where people can actually believe it, then there is that kind of photographic limitation, unless you invent some kind of alternative history where people were actually doing photography before it was known they were doing photography. So yeah, that's for sure an issue we think about. I'd say, yeah, as regards drawing, some of the projects that Nicholas was doing before we were collaborating that had a lot of printmaking, and referred to this earlier Pictish period, where the ostensible structure of it was that there was an 18th century antiquarian studying the Picts and making etchings of what he thought their lives were like. So that would be an example of kind of using either printmaking or drawing to kind of try and kind of evoke a certain time period before photography.
Yeah, we're right now in discussion about a new project that might take place in many different time periods, following from Pompeii to the 1500s to the 18th century to the earliest period of photography, 1830s and 40s. So we're talking about using those different time periods through a secret society that moves through all these different times, is dealing with pagan gods. But the time period at the beginning of the 20th century is just so rich with spectacular progress in the history of photography, so many possible things that's always drawn us. And I always imagine myself living in the 20s and 30s. It could be a past life. But for me, the world ceased to be interesting, particularly post 1944-45. Stylistically, I didn't feel like it was a world I wanted to live in after that. I always preferred the style of everything that was built before the war. And so it was just sort of a mental cutoff point for me historically. And thus I could skip everything from 44 to the near future. And so I like setting things in the future in a believable sort of post-apocalyptic world, or space travel to Mars or the moon. That's another way to not deal with today.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think people don't sufficiently think about how important imaginative sympathy is, and that if you are very much in tune with a different era, not the one your own, that can actually drive the nature of your creativity. I don't know if you've ever come across Robertson Davies' Cornwall trilogy of novels, which involve, they center around a man who forged medieval painting, and because that was the era he was in tune with. It's a really beautiful trilogy of novels. So as somebody who thinks a lot about forgers and fakers and how they are in tune with whatever era they've decided they're going to focus on, I think this is this question of aesthetic sympathy is underappreciated. I actually don't think I dealt with it sufficiently in my book either, but so I'm really glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I'd say there's also another issue, is that you generally need a certain amount of time to pass before you can look at historical events and kind of like have some context for them, which I think is, is also because we're so interested in history. I'd say that it's very hard to kind of figure out the present. And it's often easier to figure out the present by looking at different time periods. And so I feel like we've done a lot of trying to kind of deal with our anxieties about the present by kind of looking at these difficult times in the past. Because if you think about people living in the 20s and 30s, they were either living through the apocalypse or it was about to land right on top of them. And so you think about the various things going on in the world at the moment, like climate change and so on, that are very anxiety-making potential apocalypse about to be visited on us. Sometimes it can be useful to look at the past.
Yeah, I myself have recently been rereading World War I memoirs because there's something about that zeitgeist that rings for me right now. I wanted to ask you about what are some of the most sort of interesting or unusual audiences' reactions you get if you get a chance to be around people when they kind of realize that it's not all true, or there's something they don't understand, or they start to ask questions about what parts of it are real. What goes on with your audiences?
Yeah,
One that
go ahead.
I'll let you go, Richard.
Okay. Well, one that comes to mind was we made a head out of bread that we hammered nails into and then displayed in the middle in a kind of vitrine surrounded by pastries. And a man came in and started haranguing the gallery dealer because he thought we'd actually dug up a Native American actual mummified head and put it in the vitrine. So occasionally people have completely thought that some of this stuff is real, which is can always be a little mind-boggling.
The one that comes to mind for me is my memory. We had a big show of Iceberg Freistadt in one of the best museums in Lubeck that had some of our heroes, Caspar David Friedrich paintings in it. Spectacular place to show. Super excited. And the mayor of Lubeck was part of introducing the show at the opening night. And he was in discussion. He loved the show so much, and he was in discussion with the curator there. If there was any way they could create a permanent exhibit of our fictionalized history of Lubeck that would float in the river in Lubeck, and so they were willing to commemorate forever this fictional half-real history of Lubeck as a permanent site for all of Lubeck to see. So I loved their willingness to let two American, one weirdo Jewish one, reimagine the history of their state in such a free way. But it's something that no German would have ever done. We're a lot freer with history than the people who had to live through the real history there.
So you almost had a moment of crossing over to becoming a simulacrum, building a simulacrum.
Truly, truly.
How wonderful. That's a great story. So as you know from my book, I call this fictive art because I'm really interested in how the imagery supports the narrative and how they bind together. Parafiction's another word, superfiction also. I'm wondering if there's a way that you consistently describe this kind of work to other people who may not have a clue as to what it is you're actually trying to do.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because I think for us describing it to people, we don't necessarily want to prescribe what their reaction to it's going to be, or give them, a clue as to how to read it. We kind of like the ambiguity. So generally, I do struggle to kind of describe it.
I often call it imagine visual art as if it was a novel, and with the suspension of disbelief and some reality mixed in, but using all the techniques of filmmaking, creating visual art, and using the part that people have to imagine in their head coming from the objects in a show as much as the writing in it. And so and I do often feel comfortable saying that a lot of our influences are speculative fiction. So that seems to work for the past stuff and the future stuff that we work with.
Yeah, because sometimes we've actually found that, we'll start a project and we'll have like outlandish ideas. So what if so-and-so happened? And then we'll research it and it'll be like, well, so-and-so did happen. So yeah, it can be a little hard to describe, but I generally concur with what Nicholas says, that it is almost like it does have this novelesque quality, but kind of a novel where I'd say, to amend that, I'd say it's a kind of novel where you don't really know how much of it's true or not true, because normally a novel you think it's purely fiction. So I'd say we exist in that kind of realm that's sort of between a travelogue and a novel. Like this, working in those forms can make it easier to suspend the audience's disbelief, so they're pulled deeper into the world.
Yeah, and the pulling deeper does seem to be part of the point. If they're not exactly sure what's going on, they have to spend a little more time thinking about it. And responding to it and putting it together almost like a giant puzzle.
Precisely.
I'm going to open the floor shortly to the audience for questions. So if you have questions, you could start putting them in the chat. You can also raise your hands when we get there. But I wanted to take one more moment to ask Nicholas and Richard what they're working on now that they might be ready to tell people about, or have been more recently doing that I didn't show that they would like people to know about.
Well, I can show you what I'm working on right now. It's behind me. These are a kind of kite that I'm starting these paintings on satin with very strange details, and these floating heads. They're minor gods, lesser known gods, and the characters are going to be requested. There will be photos of characters sending these kites up to the gods, and because these are fairly under-known Roman gods who haven't had many inquiries and much practice with people lately, they may be more open to helping us with some of the issues around climate change and fascism and all the various things that are going wrong on the planet right now. So petitioning ancient minor gods with kites is one of the aspects of the next project, one of many aspects.
Yeah, I'd say the other aspect, the photographic aspect, is probably going to center around the theme of pilgrimage. So we're going to try and kind of like perform a certain quantity of pilgrimages that we'll kind of do as a certain kind of book, and it'll involve some of the kites that Nicholas is working on, as well as various other things. So it's kind of early stages.
Here's a painting on vellum I'm really intrigued with early vellum books and making strange symbology that might hang in the forests and sort of the kind of living theater of going through a forest and finding clues towards books. We're both interested also in the aspects of this. There was a kids book when we were young by Kit Williams called Masquerade, where you would find this treasure if you followed the clues. So there may be within this project as well an embedded kind of game where you will find something that we make and that might involve some of these paintings on vellum. So these are many of the different influences that are coming into this at the same time.
I love that, and I have to say I'm one of those people who loved Masquerade. I still have my copy from many years ago, although I never successfully solved the puzzle until other people had already done so. I'm very glad to see Beauvais Lyons here with us today, because I was thinking about him earlier when you were talking about printmaking, since his work depends partly on the convincing nature of 19th century printmaking as a carrier of scientific knowledge. But he's talking in the chat about how the postage stamps, which are also reminiscent of Donald Evans's work, and the postcards are a form of graphic vernacular that might be thought of as another example of ethnographic artifacts. And he was hoping you'd speak a little bit to the way you use those forms in your approach, and whether you're working with mostly pre-digital objects, or you're using both analog and digital methods when you're working with these ephemera objects and this printed matter?
Yeah, we're definitely using both analog and digital. Often we'll take older things, like a lot of that not geld money that you showed pictures of earlier. That involved scanning actual not geld and then replacing the drawings in the middle with pictures of the icebergs. So it's often used in that way. I'd say finding real ephemera can be a great kind of generative kind of thing for us. And so, Nicholas recently was talking about an album that someone had given him of old postcards taken in from Brittany. We're planning to do something with that. But it's a very, very important generative aspect of all this, I'd say.
And Donald Evans, I had his book years and years ago and loved that. And because I grew up as a stamp collector, because my dad was a big stamp collector, and so I was a huge coin collector and a little less big stamp collector. So both have influenced graphically learning. A lot of the coin collecting influenced the circular designs and circular photos we have, and the circular reliefs I sometimes do, and painting people in profile. The stamps influenced a lot of the framing devices that we use. And the magic of seeing Donald Evans and how he created these fictional worlds through that medium was really influential at an early point, to see the possibilities of any of these minor arts can be useful in a narrative and an artistic way. Like I'm right now got books on the history of kite design and kite painting, and trying to think of a new way to use kites, because it's another minor art form that can tell a story in a really strange way and interact with the world in a way that people might not suspect, which is what I liked about his work.
Beauvais, did you want to add something? I couldn't tell if that's why you had your camera on.
No, but just to say I love your work, Richard and Nicholas, and it's so exciting to hear you talk about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
For those who aren't familiar with Donald Evans's work, I urge you to look it up. He created a large number of fictional countries entirely through the postage stamps that they produced. A really lovely body of work cut short by his untimely death. Thomas Doyle, thank you for joining us. It says, the objects that you make are so beautiful and evocative, have so many levels and so much other content that binds the work together. How do you prefer people experience your work? Through web, or through books, or through the gallery? The web seems to offer the opportunity to tell multiple aspects of the story, but so much can get lost visually and experientially.
Yeah, I have pretty strong opinion about that. My ideal form for all this is books. I feel the web is too non-tactile. And I like the art gallery shows, but again, the context of that means that you immediately have a certain way that a knowledgeable viewer is going to view it in a certain light if it's in a gallery. Whereas a book, it could be, it's much more ambiguous, and so and it's tactile. It's an actual object. And generally speaking, whenever we do one of these projects, we feel the project is finally finished once we've done a book of the project.
I do get excited at big museum shows where we may have 2 or 3 projects going simultaneously, and you go from one room to another, you see all the physical objects, you look at the photos if there's photos involved in it, you read some of the text, you go home having experienced the objects. Hopefully there's a few books there that you can buy at the museum show and then go deeper into the storylines that way, but having the memory of having experienced and learned the project through the physical world of the things. And similarly, the web has aspects where it leads you in and then you can follow kind of lots of strange and interesting sideline research from the web about stuff that you see on our site. So there's aspects of that are fun, which you can't do as easily in the museum show unless you're looking at your little phone while you're trying to work out the clues. So aspects of all of them are good, but yeah, the book is the joy of joys usually.
Are there other questions from our audience? Carrie says, what about augmented reality as a possibility for the work?
I'd say that's kind of one of the kind of issues we face is because we're a kind of cottage industry. We're kind of quite limited in time in what we can do. So something like that could be interesting in the way it could overlap with something like a Kit Williams Masquerade project, where it can become like a game and a puzzle that where you can get clues in real time, no matter where you are. But trying to think how we'd ever deal with the technical aspect of that is a little mind-boggling.
Yeah, my brain just doesn't like spending all its time on a computer learning new programs that are gone and obsolete in a year. And I love learning new physical techniques of whatever paint and whatever format and whatever sculptural media that my body can take in and learn so much easier than programs. So I go with what we're strong with. We're not great actors, is why we don't do films. It's so obvious. We do short videos. We know our limits, but I have such respect for real filmmaking that I wouldn't want to assault it with what we come up with. And same with maybe kind of the computer end of things. It's like I respect people who know how to do this and do this well. So collaborating with someone who's got all that stuff behind it and we have the ideas, great. But without that, we're nowhere near wanting to expose how bad we are with certain types of technology.
Are there other questions from the audience? Either jump in with your microphone or jump into the chat. Simon Penny?
Yes. Hello, everyone, and Nicholas and Richard, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation about your work, which is truly fascinating. I'm just since no one else is raising their hands, I'm just interested in Nicholas's remark about learning, shall we say, artisanal skills as opposed to learning screen-based or digital software skills, because this is the center of things that I'm concerned with at present. The question. So I sympathize, and I feel the same way, even though I've been immersed in digital media for most of my career. But there is something fatiguing about, as you say, the endless treadmill of upgrades and changes and new formats and so on. So it's very pleasant to find a medium that essentially does not change, like a paintbrush and some paint. And I reflected on this 25 years ago, that or more, that the joy of working in traditional media is that you can increase the subtlety and sophistication of your skills, whereas as a digital media practitioner, I felt like I was constantly having the rug pulled out from under me and having to start as a beginner over and over again. And you don't get to accumulate and develop subtleties. This is not my talk. I'd love to hear your response, or anyone else's response to this general scenario.
I guess one thing I'd say is where the digital thing has been an amazing kind of tool for us, is that it's allowed us to generate kind of endless amounts of kind of graphic ephemera for these projects, whether it be posters or the Knot Guild, or messing around with postcards, or some of these card decks, all those things in the kind of realm of desktop publishing. It's amazing for that.
Right.
But kind of beyond that as a thing in and of itself, I think, yeah, it's less of interest to us.
Yeah, and like some of the things that were generated are scanned from physical watercolor illustrations or any number of other media, and the other recent card deck was actually floating physical people and props and flowers that I had to grow in the soil right by the project and throw in the water, and experience the gritty earthiness of trying to do living sculpture with flowers, capture it digitally, piece it together, and reproduce it and send it out to the world. So there's elements of it that have enough earthiness to keep me happy, and then the joy of not having to do some of the tedious parts of reproduction and the joys of the digital technology.
No, understood. I was really reflecting on the pleasure of gaining sensorimotor skills in this kind of direct way, the kind of sensuousness, I suppose, of it.
Yes, certainly. Like I just started painting on goatskin vellum, and I discovered so much in just the one trial painting of why the history of all those vellum painters. There's such a great subtlety in how you can correct things with water on that engine, scrape it away. And it gave me all sorts of feedback to my hands in ways that was so, I can't wait to do more with that, just from that experience of that versus any other particular paper or plaster that I painted on. There's just a thrill to this weird living medium of painting on a skin. So that I wouldn't have learned unless I actually tried it.
Then thank you very much, Richard and Nicholas, for this conversation. Illuminating, and it makes me, as always, want to see the next thing that you're doing. Over to you, Gordy.
Well, gents, I've got to say you've created an amazing body of work, and I'm so pleased that there seems to be no end in sight. So I'd like to thank our guests, Nicholas Kahn and Richard Selesnick, and of course our host, Professor Antoinette LaFarge, for joining us tonight. Again, many thanks to Carrie Patterson of Double House Press for publishing such a fine book, Sting in the Tail, Art, Hoax, and Provocation. This is Gordy Grundy for ArtReportToday.com, bringing you a deep and beautiful dive into our worldwide arts and culture.